never forget that Melbourne always was and always will be Wurundjeri country. By hosting this event again, we are, as we do every year, and as Gary mentioned, we're able to continue to support a very, very important public interest law client of this firm. Stand Up Jewish Commitment to a Better World. I had to hesitate there because, as Gary said, we seem to change the names from time to time. I go back to the cassette days, way back when. As its long-standing honorary lawyers, the partners and staff of Arnold Bloch Leibler have the privilege of assisting Stand Up in the pursuit of social justice for the multitude of causes that Gary has spoken about already tonight. And a lot of those causes are our causes too, so the alignment for us is magnificent, and we appreciate that. You challenge us, and hopefully we challenge you to do better in this space. To Gary and the board, and to Lillian Klein for organising tonight's event, we thank you. And to the volunteers, we commend you for your leadership and your efforts. You truly embody the spirit of Ron Castan and the legacy that Ron has created of humility, selflessness, generosity. And we celebrate that tonight with tonight's award winners, Kathy and Dean. I stand before you tonight, as Gary intimated, as a direct beneficiary of Ron's insight, his wisdom and his powers of advocacy. As many of you here tonight will know, it was Ron who presented the partners of Arnold Bloch Leibler in 1993 with the opportunity to act as the lawyers for the Yorta Yorta people in their monumental land claim. This was a very difficult time in Victoria. By dint of the Yorta Yorta claim, we had no less than the Premier of Victoria saying that ordinary Victorians' backyards are under threat as a consequence of this case. Ron stood up to that, and he knew the partners of Arnold Bloch Leibler would too. And so he presented us with that opportunity, and through the work and the collaboration of the Victorian Aboriginal Legal Service. My life continues to be greatly enriched by that intervention on behalf of Ron in the Yorta Yorta struggle all those years ago. The case, the issues and the people involved continue to have a profound impact on my life. Throughout the 90s, I had the great privilege of crossing paths with Ron many times over, in particular through our close working relationship on the Yorta Yorta case. During the course of the trial, Ron acted as General Counsel, as sage advisor, giving assistance to Brian Keon-Cohen and Ross Howie, Tom Keeley and myself as we charted very difficult waters, facing over 700 parties vehemently opposed to the Yorta Yorta and what they stood for. When the Yorta Yorta peoples lost the case in 1998, in December 1998, we as a team thought the issues were so important to the general fabric of Australian civil society that we must have Ron at the next stage, at the appeal level, to lead us into that battle. I was then asked by the team to approach Ron, which I did, and he readily agreed, subject to one condition. He said he will only work on the case on a pro bono basis. Very, very Ron. I provided a copy of the reasons for judgment to Ron, and 2 days later we conferred in Ron's chambers, and I still have the image of that lounge in Ron's chambers. He wasn't lying on it, but it was there. Such a beautiful atmosphere. I myself thought we've arrived at a place where the Yorta Yorta being taken seriously. We had attempted, but Ron, with his gravitas, brought that sense of calmness to the appeal. At that conference, I asked Ron for his initial impressions of the judge's reasons for judgment. And he said, to me, it looks as if this trial judge doesn't believe the Yorta Yorta are real blackfellas. I remember Ron said that. Literally at that moment, I then said to Ron, I can confirm that is precisely the attitude that the judge took to the Yorta Yorta people. I then repeated a conversation that I had had with the judge only 3 years before. In that conversation, which involved me, the QC for the state of Victoria, and the judge, during an adjournment in the case when the court was hearing evidence at Nyunda Cultural Centre in Echuca towards the end of the case, I asked the judge, just out of kind of courtesy and to get a conversation going, what are you doing next? He said, I'm off to hear the Croker Island native title case. And I still remember it. where the real blackfellas are. That's what the judge said. When I said this to Ron, I describe it as a quip by the judge, was all the insight he needed to build his whole approach to the appeal. I watched on in awe as Ron, in the months that followed, was able to bring all these intellectual powers to the fore, all the majesty of his brilliant mind and sublime advocacy skills, as he dissected the judgment and exposed its inadequacies, which he knew was born of this regrettable slew. With Ron at the helm, the Yorta Yorta community powerfully submitted that at the heart of the judge's approach to Aboriginality lay the fallacy that no changes must be made to the Yorta Yorta people's way of life, to either cope with the impact of white occupation or to incorporate new ways of thinking. It was as if the Yorta Yorta had to be stuck in amber for them to effectively win that case, according to the trial judge. I do remember at the same time Ron told me that it was misconceptions and ignorance and fear about the other, those of a different ethnicity and culture, that lay at the heart of racism. Ron was so well authorised to opine on such things. He had just finished authoring a seminal report for the Australian Human Rights Commission on racist violence. I have a copy of that report in my office. It's very well thumbed. I refer to it as a touchstone often. It remains as fresh and insightful as it was when it was published in 1990. So for Ron, I saw it firsthand. I was in that incredibly fortunate position of watching on. The Yorta Yorta peoples was a struggle of all disempowered and all discriminated against Aboriginal people. Ron said to me once, at the same time again, that the land rights battles being waged out in court had become the late 20th century version of the frontier wars being waged 100 years before. And so in the appeal, Ron challenged the court, and in doing so, all of us, to replace the stereotypes, the prejudices, the great Australian silence, as he referred to it in his closing address, to borrow from his much enamoured Bill Stannard's 1968 Boyer lectures, to replace the detailed image of Aboriginality that lay at the heart of the trial judge's judgment. He also described that in that way in his closing address. To replace it with a vision of a reconciled Australia, free of racism and cultural blindness. In the years since Ron's passing, it is organisations like Stand Up that have risen to this and to like challenges, and not only in the area of Indigenous disempowerment and racism. It features in all the things that Gary spoke about tonight so passionately. It also features in the recipients, in the work of the recipients of tonight's awards, Kathy and Dean, in the protection of women and children fleeing domestic violence, in creating life-affirming experiences for people with special needs, respectively. We'll hear more about this shortly. In doing this difficult and challenging work, Stand Up and its many friends and supporters are truly perpetuating Ron Castan's legacy of righting the wrongs of history, of standing up to injustice and power imbalance, wherever and whenever they occur, and of protecting and enriching the lives of the vulnerable. I have another cherished memory of Ron from working with him on the Yorta Yorta appeal. As you can see, it was such a rich experience for a younger lawyer than I am today, and I have to say, sucked it all up. I was there witnessing the giants. My friend, the late Lou Griffiths, was contracted by the Yorta Yorta people to film the whole of the Yorta Yorta proceedings, every nanosecond of it, at the trial. On the last morning of the appeal, and Ron was very sick at that time, in fact, as an aside, he was so sick we'd agreed the night before that Ross Howie would take the final address on the final day, and it was agreed with Ron. Enter Ron on the last day. He came into court, he couldn't help himself. And on that same last day, Lou approached him and said, "Can we film you in your final address, subject to the court's approval?" And Ron said, "I'm happy for you to do it, but it's subject to one condition, and that is, if you film it, you must also film my grandchildren who've come to see this monumental case today." Lou, of course, obliged, and for those who've seen it, the 15-minute film of the Yorta Yorta proceedings that was packaged together by him a few years later has as one of its highlights Ron in all his great powers advocating on behalf of the Yorta Yorta people, followed immediately by a couple of images of Ron's grandchildren looking on spellbound. It's a priceless image for me, and it's a simple and beautiful insight for me into what lay at the heart, I believe, of Ron's core being, the importance of family. Speaking of which, the Castan name, as we well know, belongs to a great Australian family, many of whom, as Gary said, are here tonight to celebrate this great occasion again. Castan name and the extended family will always continue to be revered by me and my partners here at Arnold Block Liebler, who named a room after Ron Castan, no less, for their exceptional and broad-reaching contributions to commerce, education, public policy, human rights, the arts, health, and the general well-being of civil society. On that note, I now welcome to the podium, or the lectern, whatever we call it, my dear friend now of 30 years. You must have been 5 when I first met you. Melissa Castan, to offer her reflections on behalf of the whole Castan family. Thank you.